On Christmas Day, he pushed me into the tree and told me to transfer the land, ruining the holiday for my grandchildren and traumatizing our entire family with his greed and violence. My own son Jerome, 49 years old, put his hands on me in front of his children, shoving me so hard into our Christmas tree that ornaments shattered on the floor, while he screamed about signing over the 350 acres of farmland that my family has owned for 4 generations. If you've ever had someone destroy a sacred holiday with violence and greed, if you know what it feels like to be physically attacked by your own child while innocent grandchildren watch in horror, if you've ever seen Christmas morning turn into a nightmare because someone couldn't wait for inheritance, pull up that chair and hold on tight. Because this story's going to show you that some people will destroy anything, even Christmas itself, when money is involved, and sometimes the most powerful justice comes when judges see how far greed can corrupt family love. I'm Abraham Washington, 76 years old. Been farming in Yazoo County, Mississippi my whole life, on land that's been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it in 1923. 350 acres of some of the richest soil in the Delta, worth over $2 million now, but worth more than money to me because every acre represents generations of Washington family blood, sweat, and determination to build something lasting in a world that didn't always welcome black land ownership. My late wife Ruth and I raised our 3 children on this land, Jerome, Marcus, and our daughter Linda, who passed too young from cancer 10 years ago. We taught them that this farm wasn't just property, it was legacy, responsibility, and proof that with hard work and determination, a black family could build wealth that would benefit generations. Ruth passed 3 years ago from complications with diabetes, and losing her nearly broke my heart. But I kept the farm running because I knew she'd want me to preserve what we'd built together. That's when Jerome and his wife Patricia started their campaign to help me manage what they called my overwhelming responsibilities. They'd visit every few weeks with suggestions about selling off portions of the land, simplifying operations, or bringing in professional management companies to handle what they claimed was becoming too much for a man my age. Jerome had never shown much interest in farming when he was growing up. Preferred working construction and making what he called real money, instead of depending on weather and crop prices. But after Ruth died and he realized how valuable our land had become, suddenly he was full of advice about agricultural investment strategies and estate planning. That Christmas morning was supposed to be special, our first holiday celebration since Ruth passed, with my grandchildren Sarah and little Abraham opening presents under the tree that Ruth and I had decorated together for 47 years. Instead, it became the day I learned that some people will destroy the most sacred moments when they smell money, and that my own son was willing to traumatize his children to steal what he thought should already be his. And if you're wondering how a Christmas morning assault led to court orders that not only protected my land, but fined my son for elder abuse and banned him from ever inheriting what he tried to steal through violence, well, hit that subscribe button on Grandpa's Diaries. Because this story's about to show you that sometimes the people who think holidays make you vulnerable are about to learn that judges take Christmas assault very personally. And sometimes the most meaningful gift you can give yourself is the courage to protect what your ancestors built from the people who think they deserve it without earning it. Jerome used to be my little helper around the farm, the son who'd follow me through the cotton fields, asking a million questions about planting schedules, soil conditions, and weather patterns. When he was 8 years old, he'd wake up at dawn to help me feed the livestock, wearing tiny overalls that Ruth had sewn for him, proud to be working alongside his daddy like a real farmer. I remember teaching him to drive the tractor when he was 12, explaining how our land had been purchased by his great-great-grandfather with money saved from sharecropping and determination to own something that could never be taken away. "Son," I told him, "this dirt under your fingernails represents freedom. Your ancestors died for the right to own land, and we're going to protect that right for your children and their children." Jerome seemed to understand those lessons back then. He'd help with harvest season, work in Ruth's vegetable garden, and talk about maybe studying agriculture in college so he could modernize our farming operations. But somewhere around high school, Jerome decided that farming was old-fashioned and that real success meant working in town, making steady wages, and not depending on weather and market prices for income. When he married Patricia, a woman from Jackson who'd never lived outside the city, I was happy for him, even though I could see she didn't understand rural life or family farming traditions. Patricia was polite enough during visits, but she'd make comments about how isolated our farm was, how much work it required, and how difficult it must be to maintain such a large property. "Abraham," she'd say during family dinners, using that tone city people use when they think they're being helpful, "you're getting older, and this farm is so much responsibility. Have you ever considered what you might do with all this land if farming becomes too difficult?" The questions became more frequent and more pointed after Ruth died. Patricia would bring articles about elderly farmers who'd been injured in equipment accidents, stories about families who'd lost their land because aging parents couldn't keep up with mortgage payments or property taxes. "We're not trying to pressure you, Abraham," she'd say, "but we are trying to be realistic about the challenges you're facing." Jerome started parroting Patricia's concerns during our conversations, asking about my succession planning and whether I'd considered liquidating non-essential acreage to create more manageable operations. The language was getting more sophisticated, like they'd been researching agricultural real estate and estate planning strategies. But the most troubling change was how they started talking about the farm's value in front of their children. Sarah and little Abraham would hear their parents discussing property assessments, development potential, and inheritance timelines like the land was already theirs to manage. "Kids," Jerome would say, "when Granddaddy gets too old to farm, this land is going to provide for our whole family's future." The pressure campaign intensified in the months leading up to Christmas, with Jerome and Patricia making increasingly aggressive suggestions about what they called my transition planning. They'd bring real estate assessments showing how much our land was worth, development proposals from companies wanting to build subdivisions, and legal documents about tax advantages of early inheritance transfers. During Thanksgiving dinner, just a month before the Christmas incident, Jerome brought his friend Marcus Johnson, a real estate developer who specialized in agricultural land conversions. Marcus spent the entire meal explaining how valuable our property would be for residential development, how demand for rural housing was increasing, and how much money could be made by selling to the right developers. "Mr. Washington," Marcus said over Ruth's cornbread recipe that I'd finally learned to make myself, "this is some of the most valuable agricultural land in Mississippi. With the right zoning changes, you could be looking at development values of $10,000 to $15,000 per acre. That's potentially $5 million in total value." I listened politely while Marcus explained various schemes for monetizing our land. Development partnerships, sale-leaseback arrangements, and phased conversion plans that would maximize profit while minimizing tax consequences. Every suggestion involved separating me from ownership of land that had been in our family for generations. "Gentlemen," I said, setting down my coffee cup and looking directly at Marcus, "this land isn't for sale, isn't for development, and isn't available for any kind of partnership. My family has been farming this soil for 4 generations, and we intend to keep farming it for 4 more. The silence around that dinner table was uncomfortable. Marcus looked embarrassed, Jerome looked frustrated, and Patricia looked angry that I'd rejected what she obviously considered a generous opportunity. But I could see the calculation in their eyes, the wheels turning as they tried to figure out how to get around my stubbornness. After Marcus left, Jerome tried to convince me that I was being unrealistic about the farm's future. "Dad, you're 76 years old. How much longer can you realistically keep working this land? What's going to happen when you can't do the physical work anymore?" "Son," I replied, "I've been farming this land for 53 years. When the time comes that I can't do it anymore, I'll make appropriate arrangements. But that time isn't now, and those arrangements aren't yours to make." I should have recognized that conversation as the moment Jerome chose greed over respect, but I still believed that family bonds were stronger than financial temptation. I thought the boy I'd raised to understand legacy and responsibility would never seriously consider destroying his father's peace of mind for money. The phone call started the week before Christmas, Jerome checking on me multiple times a day, asking about my health, my activities, my ability to handle what he called complex farm management decisions. "Dad, I'm worried about you being alone on that big farm," he'd say. "Maybe we should arrange for more regular check-ins or have someone come by to help with administrative tasks." Dully-doom. What he was really doing was building a case for my incompetency, documenting examples of confusion or difficulty that could be used later to justify taking control of my property. Every conversation became an evaluation. Every interaction became evidence in a legal case I didn't know was being prepared against me. Christmas morning was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to focus on family and gratitude instead of property and money. I'd spent weeks preparing Ruth's traditional Christmas dinner, decorating our tree with ornaments we'd collected over 47 years of marriage, and wrapping presents for Sarah and little Abraham that I'd bought with genuine excitement about watching them celebrate. Christmas morning started beautifully, with Sarah and little Abraham arriving early to help me finish preparing dinner and arrange presents under the tree that Ruth and I had decorated together for nearly 5 decades. The house smelled like Ruth's famous honey ham and sweet potato casserole, and for a few hours I almost forgot about the tension that had been building between Jerome and me over the farm's future. But when Jerome and Patricia arrived around noon, I could tell something was different. Jerome was carrying a briefcase instead of presents, and Patricia had that fake smile she wore when she was planning something unpleasant. They made small talk through dinner, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension, like they were waiting for the right moment to spring whatever trap they'd prepared. After we'd finished eating and the children were playing with their new toys in the living room, Jerome asked if we could have a private conversation in the kitchen. Patricia stayed with the kids, but I could see her positioning herself where she could hear everything that was said. "Dad," Jerome began, pulling legal documents from his briefcase, "Patricia and I have been doing a lot of thinking about your situation here on the farm. We've consulted with lawyers and financial advisors, and everyone agrees that immediate action is needed to protect your assets and ensure proper succession planning." He spread documents across my kitchen table. Property transfer deeds, power of attorney forms, and what looked like sale agreements with development companies. "These papers will transfer ownership of the farm to me, while allowing you to remain here as long as you want. It protects the land from estate taxes and ensures that everything stays in the family." "Jerome," I said, "we've discussed this before. I'm not ready to transfer ownership of this farm to anybody. When that time comes, I'll make those decisions myself." That's when his mask slipped completely. "Dad, you don't understand what's at stake here. This land is worth millions of dollars, and you're sitting on it like it's some kind of museum. We could be developing this property, creating real wealth for the whole family." I stood up from the kitchen table and walked toward the living room where my grandchildren were playing. "Jerome, this conversation is over. It's Christmas Day, and I want to spend it with my family, not arguing about money." That's when he exploded. Jerome grabbed me by the arm, spinning me around so hard I nearly lost my balance. "You stubborn old fool. You're going to sign these papers right now, or I'm going to have you declared incompetent and take this farm anyway." The children looked up from their toys, and I could see fear in their eyes as their father's voice got louder and more threatening. Sarah, who was 14 and old enough to understand what was happening, started crying. Little Abraham, who was only 12, dropped his new football and backed against the wall. "Jerome, stop it," I said, trying to keep my voice calm for the children's sake. "You're scaring your kids." But Jerome was beyond reason, beyond family loyalty, beyond any concern for his children's well-being. He shoved me backward, hard enough that I stumbled into our Christmas tree, ornaments shattering on the floor as the tree swayed dangerously. "Transfer the land," he screamed, his face contorted with rage and greed. "You're gonna die soon anyway, and this family deserves what you're hoarding. Sign these papers and stop being so selfish." I caught myself against the wall, cuts on my hands from broken ornaments, while my grandchildren sobbed in terror, and Patricia stood in the doorway doing nothing to stop her husband from assaulting their grandfather on Christmas morning. The tree that Ruth and I had decorated with love and memory was now a crime scene, and the holiday we'd planned to celebrate family had become a nightmare of violence and betrayal. After Jerome and Patricia left that Christmas afternoon, taking their terrified children and their unsigned documents, I sat in my living room, surrounded by broken ornaments and the wreckage of what was supposed to be a holy day. The Christmas tree was crooked now, leaning against the wall where Jerome had shoved me, and every shattered decoration reminded me of how my own son had chosen greed over family, violence over respect. The children's faces haunted me most. The terror in Sarah's eyes when she saw her father attack her grandfather, the confusion in little Abraham's expression as he watched his daddy destroy Christmas morning with anger and greed. Those babies had been traumatized by their parents' financial obsession, forced to witness violence that would probably affect their understanding of family and safety for the rest of their lives. But I wasn't the helpless old man Jerome thought he was dealing with. 53 years of farming had taught me about preparation, documentation, and protecting what matters most. The next morning, I called Samuel Davis, the best agricultural law attorney in Mississippi, and asked him to come to the farm immediately. "Mr. Washington," Samuel said after I'd explained what happened on Christmas Day, "what your son did constitutes elder abuse, assault and battery, and attempted fraud. The fact that he committed these crimes in front of children on Christmas Day makes it even more serious. We need to take immediate legal action to protect you and your property." We spent the rest of that week documenting everything that had happened, not just the Christmas assault, but the months of psychological pressure and financial manipulation that had led up to it. Samuel explained my options: criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and emergency court orders to prevent Jerome from attempting any future coercion. "The key to this case," Samuel explained, "is going to be the testimony of your grandchildren. They witnessed the assault, they can describe the fear and trauma they experienced, and their testimony will show the jury exactly what kind of man would terrorize his own family to steal his father's property." I struggled with the decision to involve Sarah and little Abraham in legal proceedings. They were just children, and they'd already been through enough trauma because of their father's actions. But Samuel convinced me that their testimony might be the only way to ensure that Jerome faced real consequences and never tried this kind of violence again. "Mr. Washington," he said, "if you don't stop him now, he'll escalate. Maybe not immediately, but eventually he'll try again, probably with even more violence. Your grandchildren's testimony could prevent them from experiencing even worse trauma in the future." Oblayisti, we filed the legal papers between Christmas and New Year's, criminal complaints for assault and elder abuse, civil lawsuits for intentional infliction of emotional distress and attempted fraud, and emergency injunctions to prevent Jerome from accessing or controlling any portion of my property. The sheriff served him with papers at his house on New Year's Eve, which seemed somehow appropriate given how he destroyed our family's Christmas celebration. The initial court hearing was scheduled for mid-January, and I spent those weeks preparing myself emotionally for what was coming. This wasn't just about protecting my land anymore. It was about protecting my grandchildren from a father who thought violence was an acceptable tool for getting what he wanted, and protecting future elderly family members from someone who'd clearly learned that abuse could be profitable if you got away with it. Samuel warned me that family court cases involving elder abuse and property disputes could get ugly, especially when substantial assets were involved. "Jerome's going to try to portray you as a confused old man who misunderstood his family's legitimate concern for your welfare," he said. "We need to be prepared for character assassination and attempts to make you look incompetent or unreliable." But I was ready for that fight. Jerome had made his biggest mistake when he assumed that my age made me weak, that my grief over Ruth's death had made me vulnerable. that Christmas morning would provide the perfect cover for his assault. Instead, he'd revealed his true character at the worst possible time, in front of the worst possible witnesses, creating evidence that no lawyer could explain away or minimize. The trial took place in February, and the courtroom was packed with community members who'd heard about the case through local news coverage and word-of-mouth outrage. Elder abuse cases involving land disputes aren't uncommon in rural Mississippi, but something about a Christmas Day assault had captured people's attention and anger. Judge Catherine Brooks, a stern woman in her 60s who'd grown up on a farm herself, presided over the proceedings with obvious disgust for what Jerome had done. She'd reviewed all the evidence beforehand, including the police reports, medical documentation of my injuries, and psychological evaluations of the trauma inflicted on the children. Jerome had hired an expensive lawyer from Jackson, a smooth-talking man who tried to portray the whole incident as a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand due to my emotional instability following Ruth's death. Their strategy was to paint me as a grieving widower who couldn't think clearly about business decisions and had misinterpreted his family's legitimate concerns. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jerome's lawyer said during opening statements, "this case isn't about elder abuse or assault. This is about a loving son trying to help his aging father make rational decisions about a valuable property that requires complex management. Mr. Abraham Washington is a proud man who doesn't want to admit that his wife's death has affected his judgment. But their strategy collapsed the moment Sarah took the witness stand. Samuel had prepared her carefully, explaining that she needed to tell the truth about what she'd seen, that her grandfather needed her help to make sure the bad things didn't happen again. "Sarah," Samuel said gently, "can you tell the court what you saw happen in your grandfather's house on Christmas morning?" "Daddy pushed Granddaddy into the Christmas tree," Sarah said, her voice steady but small. "He was yelling really loud and being really mean. Granddaddy was bleeding from the broken ornaments, and the tree almost fell down. I thought Daddy was going to hurt Granddaddy really bad." The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Sarah's testimony and the occasional gasp from jurors who were clearly moved by this young girl's description of family violence on Christmas morning. "Were you scared?" Samuel asked. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I thought maybe Daddy was going to push Granddaddy again, or maybe throw him down. Little Abraham was crying, and I didn't know what to do." Little Abraham's testimony was even more devastating. When asked what he remembered about Christmas morning, he said, "Daddy was real mad about papers, and he hurt Granddaddy by the Christmas tree. All the pretty ornaments got broken, and Granddaddy was bleeding. I don't want Daddy to hurt Granddaddy anymore." Jerome's lawyer tried to cross-examine the children, but Judge Brooks shut that down immediately. "Counselor," she said, "this court will not permit the intimidation of child witnesses who have already been traumatized by your client's criminal behavior. These children have provided clear, consistent testimony about what they witnessed. The rest of the trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical documentation of my injuries, the children's testimony about the violence they'd witnessed, and expert testimony about elder abuse patterns and the psychological impact of domestic violence on children. When Judge Brooks delivered her verdict, her voice was filled with righteous anger. "Mr. Jerome Washington, you have committed crimes that shock the conscience of this court and this community. You physically assaulted your 76-year-old father on Christmas morning, traumatized your own children, and attempted to steal property through violence and intimidation. The punishment was swift and comprehensive. Jerome was convicted of elder abuse and assault, sentenced to 6 months in jail and 2 years probation. He was ordered to pay $75,000 in damages for medical expenses, legal costs, and emotional trauma. Most importantly, Judge Brooks issued a permanent restraining order preventing Jerome from contacting me or accessing my property, and she declared him permanently ineligible to inherit any portion of my estate. This court finds that the defendant poses an ongoing threat to the plaintiff's safety and property," Judge Brooks declared. Christmas Day should be about family love and gratitude, not violence and greed. This defendant has shown that he cannot be trusted with either his father's welfare or his children's emotional security. 2 years have passed since that Christmas morning assault, and my farm is thriving under the protection of court orders that ensure Jerome can never again threaten my safety or my property. The 350 acres are more productive than ever, managed with the help of respectful tenant farmers who understand that this land represents legacy, not just profit. Jerome served his jail sentence and has been making his court-ordered payments on schedule, probably because he knows that any violation would result in additional criminal charges and longer imprisonment. The $75,000 judgment has funded security improvements, legal protections, and a scholarship fund for agricultural students who understand the value of preserving family farming traditions. Sarah and little Abraham visit me regularly now, under a supervised visitation arrangement that protects them from their father's continued anger and resentment. They're healing from the trauma of that Christmas morning, learning that their grandfather's house is a safe place where violence doesn't happen, and family means protection rather than predation. "Granddaddy," Sarah asked me last weekend while we were walking through the cotton fields that her great-great-grandfather had first planted, "why did Daddy try to hurt you on Christmas?" It's a question that breaks my heart every time she asks it. Because how do you explain to a child that some people choose money over love, greed over family, violence over patience? "Baby girl," I told her, "sometimes people get confused about what's really important in life. Your daddy thought having this land was more important than being kind to the person who raised him. My will has been updated to reflect everything that happened. Sarah and little Abraham will inherit the farm when they're old enough to understand its value and protect it from people who might try to exploit them. Until then, the property is protected by trusts and legal structures that ensure it continues to benefit our community and preserve our family's agricultural heritage." The legal victory was satisfying, but the real victory is seeing my grandchildren smile again, knowing that they're learning the difference between right and wrong from someone who actually understands the difference. Jerome tried to use Christmas morning as cover for his assault, thinking that holiday sentiment would make me vulnerable to his threats. Instead, he created evidence that no jury could ignore and trauma that no lawyer could excuse. I learned something important during those months of legal battles and family destruction. Sometimes the people who think holidays make you emotionally vulnerable are about to discover that judges take holiday violence very personally. Jerome thought Christmas morning would provide the perfect opportunity to pressure me into signing away my land, but instead, he chose the worst possible day to reveal his true character to his own children. The neighborhood is peaceful now, filled with the sounds of farming equipment and seasonal workers, rather than the echoes of domestic violence and family destruction. My neighbors check on me regularly, and the community has rallied around protecting elderly farmers from predatory family members who see inheritance as something to be stolen rather than earned. Christmas morning 2 years ago should have been about gratitude, family, and celebrating the legacy that Ruth and I built together. Instead, it became the day that revealed who Jerome really was when money was involved, and the day that ultimately protected my land from someone who would have destroyed everything meaningful about it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had family members destroy holidays with their greed and violence? Have you ever watched children be traumatized by adults who cared more about money than family? Have you ever realized that sometimes the most sacred days reveal people's truest characters? And if this story reminded you that age doesn't equal vulnerability when you're prepared to fight for what's right, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about protecting what your ancestors built, about the power of children's testimony to deliver justice, and about learning that sometimes the most important gift you can give yourself is the courage to prosecute family members who think blood relation gives them the right to commit crimes. Christmas should be about love and gratitude, not violence and theft. And sometimes the best way to preserve holiday traditions is to make sure that people who destroy them face real consequences. I'll see you next week with another cup of coffee and another lesson about never letting anyone convince you that holidays make you weak. Sometimes they just reveal who's strong enough to protect what matters most.